So what exactly is communization theory, and how is it different from communist theory, or communism more generally? Where does it come from? What does it mean? So communization comes out of like the mid-60s French and Italian movements. It owes a lot to the Italian autonomous movement, and it's mostly originates or is like concretely theorized in France in the mid-60s by people like Gilles Dauvé and I think his name is Jacques Camat. He's another big-time communization theorist. And basically the idea of communization theory it's a revolutionary theory. It's not like a Marxist theory of economics about how, capitalism works, or, about how like the money commodity is like a different thing than how bourgeois economists see it. It's not an economic theory. It's a theory strictly, of revolution, and as such, it comes out of, it must, in order to be valid, to even have any pretense of being valid to revolutionary struggle, it needs to come out of actual like workers' movement. The movement it comes out of is the kind of movement that we see in the 60s in Europe, which in May '68 there's like the biggest wildcat strike in a developed nation in history, like the famous May '68 strike that completely shut down France's economy across the entire country. As well as in Italy, there are a lot of things like work stoppages and like sabotage, and also a lot of theorizing and movement of the struggle out of the workplace, like strictly conceived, and into other areas of life, like the domestic sphere, the reproductive sphere of capitalist existence. So not just about like workers' struggle within the workplace, but actually workers' struggle in every aspect of life. And the idea of communization theory, it is really about it's centered on this idea of the class relationship and how that relationship gets reproduced over time. It's really, like philosophically speaking, very rooted in concepts of ontology. So the idea of a being that persists in the same identity over time, like the idea of repetition of the class relationship from one moment to the next, either through, from like 1 minute to the next. The class relationship is reproduced when the worker is continually assenting to, subject themselves to the capitalist to keep doing the labor. And also at the end of the work day, when the workers are all released to go, to their homes and do whatever is necessary in order to make it to work the next day, when they do reappear in the morning, then they are reproducing the class relationship again. And also, on the capitalist side, when they are reinvesting their profits back into their enterprise, in order to continually innovate, in order to keep getting more and more efficient to increase the profit margins, that is the capitalist doing their part to reproduce the class relationship. So communization theory is really about this idea of reproducing the relationship of exploitation, which is obviously that idea of an exploitative class relationship between the working class and the ruling class is obviously it's at the heart of every communist theory. There are a million strains of socialism, communism, however you want to call it. Communization theory is one of many. It's on the left side of the spectrum. It's a left communist kind of idea. But communization is really focusing on that relationship, not as a kind of static or logically determined inevitability, but really thinking of it as a process, something that needs to be repeated in time from one moment to the next. However you conceive of a moment, either like a day, a work day, a shift, or like ultimately it comes down to like from literally 1 second to the next, the worker as their identity as a being is being reproduced through, like like I don't want to get into it, but there are a lot of complex ideas about how ontology and identity works. But the individual's identity is repeated from one moment to the next, and they are also, repeating whatever the activity it is that puts them into this like particular class relationship. Like all of the social dynamics that make up capitalist society, the communization theory really wants to stress that they are like processes that are ongoing. They're really not a given. There are things that need to be repeated, reconstituted. Yes. So the idea of communization theory is about like no longer like the idea of the communization theory idea of revolution is stopping to reproduce that class relationship. So from one moment to the next, like just no longer, being subjected to your employer. I mean, immediately to me it sounds always like very anarchistic, very like dependent on spontaneity. There are a lot of like obviously responses that the communization theorists would have to that sort of claim, but yeah, ultimately like the idea is really about like seeing capitalism and all of the dynamics. The fundamental dynamic of capitalism is the relationship between the worker and the boss. So that relationship is a process. It needs to be repeated. It has its own being in time. And in order to like have a communist revolution where you're not going to have these kinds of exploitative relationships between individuals and like try to reconfigure society like so that it is based on completely different principles of like equality and whatnot, it is not sufficient to do any kind of like gradual process or whatever. Like you can't have like communization theory is in distinction to theories of revolution that depend on things like a vanguard party, where you have like a group of people who are kind of like building a momentum, building a movement, building a revolution. It's against like any kind of ideas of like multiple stages of moving from like a dictatorship of the proletariat to like an actual bona fide communism after like a generations long process of undoing ideology and whatnot. But like all of those things like are too gradual, and really they keep in place the same essential dynamic, the same relationship, the same processes are still kept in place. They're just slightly reconfigured so that for example, in the USSR, it is it's like the communization theorist is going to say that the Russian Revolution was never really communist or never even really socialist because they failed to like stop that kind of relationship. They really just shifted the parameters a little bit. This is where like communization theory is really tied up in value form theory, so I won't talk more about that. If you are interested in more about that, then you should listen to my podcast episode. I think it was episode 2.4. The title is Communization and Value Form Theory. My co-host and I really get into it in depth. and like kind of explain like the history more clearly, and like the relationship between these two theories, value form and communization, and how they're related, how they, like just go so well together. But what I really just wanted to say is that the idea of communization theory, it's really tied into this idea, this like ontological picture of the world, where you're seeing the relationships that structure capitalist society as processes that need to be repeated. Like their identity does not exist independently of their repetition in time. And the communization revolution is about no longer reproducing that relationship, which is why some of the tactics that were employed in the movements that this theory arose from are things like wildcat strikes and work stoppages and like sabotage, and also again extending the movement outside of the like strict workspace and into the reproductive sphere, because the relationships, the processes that structure capitalist society are more pervasive than simply that between a worker and their employer. So yeah, it's really about like and it's about like from one moment to the next, choosing to no longer reproduce this the relationship that you and I and everybody is caught up in. And to me, again, it sounds spontaneous. It sounds like anarchist talk. It doesn't sound possible to really organize that kind of movement. And even some of the principal theorists talk about how like communization will occur like when the time is ready, when the time is right for it to happen as a revolution. It's going to occur like all of a sudden, and like every one of the relationships that we are engaged in, all of the processes that we as individuals and as a society reproduce and produce, that structure our society such as it is, they will all be stopped from one moment to the next. So the revolution will happen very suddenly. It will happen all at once. There's not going to be any kind of process about it. And if it does happen, it's going to be a much more thorough revolution than the ones that we can think of from like the big ones that we think of from history, like the Russian Revolution, which I mean the context is very different, but like the fact is that like a revolution in contemporary society would need to really be address itself to culture and ideology a lot more than perhaps these older ones did. But yeah, that's it for now. If you have any questions, just post a comment, and I've been reading about it quite a bit. Just for the record, I personally do not consider myself a communization theorist. Value form theory is very intriguing to me. Communization theory, it's intriguing, but I don't find myself aligned with that movement. I've been reading about it a bunch, and if you have any questions, post comments, and again, I will redirect you to my podcast on this very subject. It's very long and very thorough, and we really get into it. Some really great discussion came out of that. So give it a listen. I'll put a link, and I'll see you next time.